We have been working hard during the current crisis to assess and evaluate the magnitude and the disparate impact of the economic shutdown and to help shape a humane, adequate, and fair policy response. I will be moderating today's discussion with Robert Reich, author of The System: Who Rigged It? How We Fix It. Robert Reich is a professor at the Goldman School of Public Policy at UC Berkeley. He is an economist, an author of at least 18 books, a frequent and incisive political commentator, and the former Secretary of Labor during the Clinton administration. But all of that pales beside his most proud achievement. In 1986, Robert Reich was one of the founders of EPI. Along with Jeff Foe, Bob Kuttner, Lester Thoreau, and Barry Bluestone, he recognized that the think tank landscape was increasingly dominated by conservative, big business, anti-government, right-wing voices and money. And there was no respectable intellectual voice for working people in the national policy debate. EPI was created to fill that void. We are grateful to Bob for his support for EPI over the last 34 years, for his leadership, his principles, and his way of breaking down complex issues into actionable and inspiring messages. Bob Reich's newest book, The System: Who Rigged It? How to Fix It, lays out how wealth and power have interacted to install an elite oligarchy, eviscerate the middle class, and undermine democracy. These themes resonate powerfully as we are all living through a real-time nightmare of excessive power, wealth, and inequality, with terrible consequences for the entire society and the world. With that, I will hand it over to Bob Reich. He will speak for about 25 minutes, and then we will take some of your questions. Please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to submit your question, and we will answer as many as there is time for. Thank you very much. Introducing Professor Robert Reich.
Well, Thea, first of all, thank you so much for that introduction. Thank you for hosting this. I was shocked when you said 34 years ago EPI was founded, and I was honored to be one of the founders and still am honored and to have been on and off the board during that time. But I can't believe it's been 34 years. I mean, I was only 4 years old at the time when I founded EPI or co-founded EPI. But the topic today really does grow out of much of the research and very important work that EPI has been doing over the last 34 years. And thank you for your leadership as well, Thea. My book, The System: Who Rigged It? How We Fix It, was written before the pandemic, but sadly and tragically, the pandemic illustrates many of the themes in the book. And I thought that it might be useful to just go through 3 of those themes and show how the nightmare that we are living through. And I should also say it's not just the pandemic nightmare, it's also the economic crisis that has been brought on initially by the pandemic. And it is thirdly, the Trump administration, another nightmare. I mean, any one of these nightmares would be bad enough, but to have them all 3 occurring simultaneously is really a parade of horribles that nobody would have expected. Each one is making the others worse. The first theme in the book that resonates sadly today is that the big divide politically in America is not actually the divide we think it is. What we think the divide is every day, because we're told it over and over again, is that it's the left, as the left has been characterized, and cartoon version of the left, that is people who want more and a more robust government, versus the right, as it's been the cartoon version of the right, which is people who want less government. And that kind of cartoon debate about do you want more or less government, are you on the left or the right, might have had some importance and some relevance 10 or 15 and certainly 20 or 30 or 40 years ago it did. But now increasingly it has less and less relevance. The big divide I want to suggest, and I argue in the book, is not between traditional left and right. The big divide is between democracy and oligarchy. And by that, I mean that we have more and more over the past 40 years, wealth and power concentrating at the very top of our society. And there is almost no difference between wealth and power. as wages have stagnated, the median wage has stagnated over the last 40 years, adjusted for inflation, more and more of the nation's income and wealth have gone to the top. And that wealth has generated a great deal of political power. And I've seen it. I was in the Clinton administration. I'm very proud to have been in the Clinton administration. I was Secretary of Labor. But during that time, I saw the amount of money coming from big corporations and Wall Street overwhelming the system. I mean, far more money than was coming from the AFL-CIO or for any member unions. Far more money than was coming from environmentalists or anybody else that had a stake in any of the issues that I saw the White House grappling with, and I was grappling with at the Labor Department. I mean, it was a tsunami of big money. And this was before the shameful Citizens United decision of the Supreme Court. The money was already flowing in. All Citizens United did was open the gates even further for all that big money. And what happened and what has happened over the past 40 years increasingly is a kind of vicious cycle in which the more wealth at the top, the more power at the top to actually change the rules of the market, to make the market work in ways that people at the top want it to work in terms of the rules of mergers and acquisitions and antitrust, or the rules governing bankruptcies and bailouts, or the rules governing intellectual property, or I mean, any number of rules that actually shape the market. Those rules are not neutral. Those rules increasingly have been changed in order to reward people at the top and make it harder for everybody else in this country. And as a result, we are finding ourselves in a predicament, and we are seeing it in the pandemic. The people who and the institutions that are getting bailed out, that are doing best in this pandemic, are frankly big corporations and very wealthy people. I mean, Jeff Bezos never had it so good. Amazon is doing exceedingly well. But the people who are suffering are people who are the so-called essential workers, people who are in the Amazon warehouses, people who are nurses without the proper protective equipment, people who have no choice but to be at their job because the only alternative they are given is to lose their livelihoods. I mean, here in Alameda County, in California, you know, Elon Musk exemplifies this kind of perversion and abuse of power. Elon Musk, who from January on was saying, "Don't worry about the pandemic. It's really nothing. It's just like a common cold." He played it down. He should worry. I mean, he has billions of dollars. He can shelter. He can escape this. But he wants to reopen his factory, his Tesla factory. And last weekend, he defied the county health officials who said, "No, it's not safe to reopen." And he said, "Too bad, I'm reopening anyway, and I'm suing you. And if you don't allow me to reopen, I'm going to take away these jobs and move to another state." I mean, that's the kind of arrogance, that's the kind of entitlement, and that kind of attitude of being above the law that we see emanating from the White House. I mean, it's exactly the same stuff. And Elon Musk should be ashamed of himself. I mean, this morning, the county finally had to relent. The political power and the economic power was too much for them. And so what's happening now? Workers who are in the Tesla production plant had no choice but to have their jobs, take their jobs, or Elon Musk was recommending that they not even get unemployment insurance, because he was saying, in effect, to the state, even California, a blue state, he was saying, "Well, I've offered them jobs, they don't want to take the jobs, so they're not in employment insurance, and let you take those jobs." This is going on all over the country. This is California. I assure you that in places like Nebraska, that's not even, Nebraska yesterday decided it was not even going to disclose the number of people who are testing positive in its meat packing plants. North Carolina is not even disclosing the number of deaths from coronavirus. I mean, these states are opening up because why? Big business big business and very wealthy individuals who have absolutely less and less worry about the coronavirus because they are taking care of themselves. They are instructing these states to open up, and they're taking away the livelihoods of a lot of people if they don't take the jobs that are offered them. This is the nightmare version of what I talk about in the book in terms of really the choice being democracy or oligarchy. Oligarchy is prevailing right now, and it is threatening the lives of countless American workers. Uh, a related and second theme in the book has to do with the reality of socialism. Now, during the primary campaign in the Democratic primaries, as you all know, Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren were accused of being socialists. Bernie Sanders said, well, I'm not exactly a socialist, I'm a democratic socialist. There's a difference. But nevertheless, the oligarchy used that term to scare a lot of people. And the utility of the term socialism as a scare tactic is not new. It's been used by the oligarchy, by the establishment, by people who have a great deal of power in this country ever since Franklin D. Roosevelt proposed Social Security. They accused Roosevelt of being a socialist. But what we have now, and what I talk about in the book, is a new phenomenon, relatively new, and I call it socialism for the rich and harsh capitalism for everybody else. Because you see, it is the rich who get bailed out. They are getting the tax cuts. They are getting, in 2008, the banks got big bailouts. And right now, the biggest companies are getting bailed out by the Fed and by the Treasury. They get the bailouts, and everybody else actually has the experience of suffering the harshest form of capitalism of any advanced industrial or post-industrial country. American workers don't even know how bad they have it relative to European workers or Canadian workers or workers in Japan or any place else around the world. Australian workers, New Zealand workers, everybody else gets health insurance. Everybody else has a public health system they can rely on. Everybody else has sick leave, paid sick leave. Everybody else has a kind of unemployment insurance system that really does work for them. Our current unemployment insurance system is a pale reflection of what it used to be in terms of covering workers who actually lose their jobs. A very small percentage get any unemployment insurance. And even in this pandemic, most workers who have applied for unemployment insurance are still waiting for it because the unemployment insurance offices are so totally overwhelmed. But you see, all of this socialism for the rich and the harshest form of capitalism for everybody else is disguised. We don't really talk about it. I mean, the Fed, for an example, most Americans have no idea how the Fed works. And what the Fed is now doing in terms of taking on the debts, buying the debts of a lot of corporations that have gone deeply into debt over the last 5 years, and bought back their own shares of stock with that debt. This is one of the most insidious forms of bailouts, because this is a kind of bailout that is a moral hazard, as the term goes. It's just what we did with the banks. If you're a big corporation, if you're a CEO of a big corporation and you go deep and deeper into debt, making yourself fragile, but using that debt not to invest in your future, not for research and development, not for expanded capacity, not to improve the plight of your workers, but you use that debt to buy back your shares of stock, which is what almost every CEO has done in America. And then when the next economic downturn comes, the Fed comes along and says, oh, don't worry about it. We will take that debt off your hands. Then you figure next time around, why should you worry? You're going to go deeper and deeper into debt, and you will buy back your shares of stock all over again. That's called moral hazard. And we worry about moral hazard when it comes to the poor and working class over and over again. We say, oh, well, if they get $600 a week more in unemployment insurance than they would otherwise get, they may be tempted not to work. Well, the real moral hazard is occurring in corporate C-suites. The real moral hazard is happening as we bail out corporation after corporation, as the Fed takes on the debts of more and more of these corporations. So again, what I try to portray in the book, socialism for the rich and harshest form of capitalism for everybody else is a reality today, and it's starker than ever in this pandemic. The third and final theme I will discuss from the book has to do with the ways in which oligarchies actually traditionally, historically, and now maintain their power. Now, let me just go back a step. The word oligarchy is not a new word. It's an old ancient Greek word. It stands for, putting a little simplifying, a system in which wealth and power are in the hands of relatively few people who control not only the economy, but also control the political system. And that's what we have now. Russia is an oligarchy, but we are, I think it's fair to say also, if not an oligarchy now, we're moving very closely toward an oligarchy, given the amount of wealth and power in a very few hands in our country. Now, historically, oligarchies use a few techniques to maintain themselves. Otherwise, they're very unstable. I mean, once people know that the wealth and power is at the top, they have been known, the public have been known to stage revolutions or to do all sorts of other inconvenient things when it comes to oligarchies. So it is in the oligarchies' interest to mask their power and mask their wealth. One way they do that historically, and they are doing it even today, is to keep everybody else angry at each other. So in other words, and certainly Donald Trump understood this implicitly. Donald Trump, he campaigned as a champion of the working class, and everybody knows he is and has been a Trojan horse for the oligarchy in terms of giving them tax cuts and giving them regulatory rollbacks and giving them, in this pandemic and this economic emergency, everything they want. The interesting additional benefit to the oligarchy of Donald Trump is that he has been the most divisive president in American history. He has pitted blacks against whites and blacks and whites against Latinos against whites and whites against Latinos. And he has pitted native born against immigrants. And you all know this. I mean, we've been living it for 3.5 years. But that divisiveness, that divide and conquer strategy, I want to emphasize to you, is a strategy that oligarchies use because when people are angry at each other and attacking each other, they don't look up and they don't see where the wealth and power actually are. They fight over the crumbs. And by fighting over the crumbs, they lose sight of the fact that there is a big pie up there that the oligarchy is dividing among itself and doing exceedingly well. And they have somehow, the oligarchy persuades everybody that their real enemies are themselves, are each other, are inside a country, or sometimes, a lot of the anger directed toward immigrants, to foreigners, to foreign traders, to all sorts of people outside the United States is part of the same strategy that the oligarchies have used and oligarchs have used for years. So divide and conquer is one of the major strategies, so people don't look upward. Another major strategy of the oligarchy in history, and we can see it now, is to use a kind almost religious-like faith to justify their wealth and their power. In the 17th century, it came in the form of the divine right of kings, the assumption that royalty had the wealth and the power because God wanted the royalty to have all of that wealth and power. Today, it's a little bit more disguised. It goes under the term market fundamentalism. That is, the market is a kind of divine creation, according to this mythology, and you should feel and know that regardless of where you are in the pecking order, it's because the market so decreed. People who are billionaires deserve to be billionaires because the market has decreed that they are billionaires. They must have done something that is worthwhile to, people admire, and they want people like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and others to have billions and billions of dollars, because obviously Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk have justified that billions of dollars. And by the same token, if somebody is poor or working class, not making very much money, it must be their fault because the market has decreed so. Well, that market fundamentalism leaves out a very important point. Just like the divine right of kings was based on a mythology of divine, God-intended kind of support for royalty, so does market fundamentalism leave out the reality. The reality is that markets are made by people. Markets, the rules by which a market runs, are created by legislatures and executives and agencies and courts. And what is a market at one time in history is very different at a different time in history, depending upon how power is allocated. Power determines very much the structure of the market. The reason why, for example, if you are laden with student debt, you cannot use bankruptcy today, whereas you could have used bankruptcy a number of years ago, is because the banks and the major creditors and the financial industry changed the bankruptcy laws so that people could not use bankruptcy to reorganize their student debts. The same thing with mortgages. I mean, years ago, if you had a problem paying your mortgage, you could declare personal bankruptcy. You could rearrange your mortgage under bankruptcy. You can't do that anymore. That's not because of the divine right of the market. That's not because the market has so decreed. It's because the Wall Street and the big financial players didn't want people to be able to get out of their mortgages. And in fact, this change in bankruptcy law happened, as I recall, right after 2008, when so many people were in deep, deep trouble. Or take any area of law. I mean, intellectual property laws. It used to be the case that pharmaceuticals didn't have the ability to just have a patent or a trademark that went on forever and ever and ever. They have changed and influenced the changes in intellectual property that enables them to keep their patents and their copyrights and their trademarks for a very long time, with very small, little tiny changes in the look or the feel or the composition of whatever formula they're using. And that enables them, in turn, to have a property right that has created a pharmaceutical industry that is more expensive in this country than in almost any other country. But you can go all the way through the market, see the same exact things, changes in the laws and rules brought about by companies. Antitrust, for example, used to have a major part to play in the structure of the United States market. I mean, after the Clayton Act, the Sherman Act, in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, right through the 1960s, antitrust was a major factor. But guess what? Antitrust has been basically killed off. And it wasn't killed off by the working class. It wasn't killed off by the labor unions. It was killed off by big corporations and monopolies because they had the political power to subdue antitrust. And we could go on and on and on. You get the point. Market fundamentalism is a belief in the market that is completely unjustified, and it disguises where power really is. It disguises what is really going on. And just one final point about how the oligarchy actually disguises itself and justifies itself. Corporate social responsibility. You've heard the term over and over again. I come across it all the time. The notion that corporations really are socially responsible. They pay attention not just to maximizing shareholder returns and executive pay, but they also take responsibility for their workers and for all of the other stakeholders. The Business Roundtable, a major organization of CEOs, last August, under the aegis of Jamie Dimon, who I talk about a lot in the book, came up with a new statement that they had not only allegiance and responsibility to their shareholders, but to all of their stakeholders. This is actually the culmination of years of talk about corporate social responsibility. Let me just be very clear with you. Corporate social responsibility is a nice idea, but it's baloney. It is public relations. Corporations are not going to suddenly be different kind of creatures. They're no substitute for rules and laws that make sure that they protect their workers and provide their workers with adequate pensions, and that they do all of the things they're supposed to do for their communities. No, they're not going to do it. In fact, the reason that they have this kind of mythology of corporate social responsibility is so that they will not have to face laws and rules and regulations that require them to do all of these things. That's what they dread, but that's the only way they're going to do it. I was Secretary of Labor. I dealt with companies that actually, a few of those companies that I dealt with would, in their boardrooms, they would figure the cost and the risk of violating the law relative to the financial advantages of violating the law when it came to issues like workplace safety. And if it turned out that the cost and risk was less than the advantage to them of violating the law, they'd go ahead and do it. This is what we get from the system. The reason I entitled the book The System is because it's not about bad people or villainous people. It's about a system that has run amok. It's a system that's been rigged by abuses of power. And those abuses of power multiply and multiply as it becomes really a competitive necessity for big companies, as it becomes a way of doing business for billionaires, as the norms really shift, as they have shifted over the last 40 years. And Donald Trump and Elon Musk are just the ones that are on the tip of my tongue today, because they exemplify the shift in norms and they exemplify the changes in the system to shaft most working people and to create rewards that are unjustified in any modern society for people at the very top. Now, finally, what's the good news? Is there any good news? Well, there is some good news, and I talk about it in the book. I think that just like the Gilded Age of the 1880s, 1890s, at the turn of the last century, we are facing a reaction against the excesses of this new Gilded Age. And the 2018 midterms, I think, kind of are good evidence of what can happen when progressives and young people and many others are just fed up with the abuses of power that they see around them. I think it is very likely that the 2020 election will be a similar kind, maybe even a larger kind of demonstration of the public's outrage in this pandemic, in this economic crisis, in this time where the administration basically is thumbing its nose at democratic institutions, outrage at all of this. And I can tell you, both served in government, but also been a teacher, a professor for 40 years, that there is no generation that I've taught until this generation right now that I feel is as committed to the public good, the common good, as committed and as dedicated to changing the structure of power in this country as the young people I have had the privilege of teaching just in the past couple of years. So on that note, that positive note, I will end what I am saying to you now, and I invite your questions. And again, Thea and EPI, thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Bob. That was great. You really pack a lot of thoughtful information into a short amount of time. And I'm looking forward to the Q&A with folks. I know we've got a lot of questions. Please put them into the Q&A box down there, and we will take as many as we have time for. But I wanted to start, I'm glad you ended on an upbeat note, because we all need something to think about. How do you see, we're in the middle of this deep economic calamity and a public health crisis at the same time. And we have an election coming up in just a few months. how do you see the economic crisis and the public health crisis playing into the electoral debate?
Well, Thea, first of all, I really don't think there's any way of dealing with this economic crisis, of getting out of it, without dealing with the public health crisis. That is, the pandemic is the elephant in the middle of the room. And, I think it's important to get money to people so that they can survive. It's vitally important to protect essential workers. It's critically important to maintain shutdowns to the extent that we possibly can, and social distancing. It's vitally important to do testing and tracing, and obviously develop a vaccine. But it's ridiculous to assume that we can get out of this economic crisis without dealing with this pandemic. The pandemic is, as long as it goes on, as long as we in the United States have one of the worst records of any country in the world in terms of the rate of deaths, and also how late and how ineffectively we have dealt with this problem, we are going to face an economic crisis that is going to continue.
Thank you. And I think one of the things that you said that really resonated with me too is this idea that people are being pitted against each other, and that people are turning to blame each other, and that's part of a strategy. Of course, that's a strategy of the oligarchs, of the people at the top, the people with power, the people with wealth, to divert our attention from the true problems. How do we rise above that right now? And I'd like that you talked about your students and this new generation of people who are committed, and that's what I see certainly with the younger people around me. But how do we counter that narrative that we just have to fight amongst ourselves for a couple of crumbs while the Elon Musks and the Jamie Dimons feast lavishly?
Well, I think it's very important for Joe Biden and for everybody who is running for office as a Democrat this time around in this election cycle to be as clear as possible about the centrality of wealth and power in terms of what has happened to America, and to explain to Americans as clearly as possible why we are in the predicament we're in. Now, not the pandemic. I mean, the pandemic we didn't have any choice about, but in our response to the pandemic, and who was protected and who has been hurt, in the economic consequences, and who has been hurt and who has been bailed out, and to be angry in ways that are not only genuine, but reflect the outrage that most Americans actually should and do feel. Let me just say one other thing, Heidi. Having been a member of a Democratic administration, the Clinton administration, and I'm very proud of the work that we did in that administration, but I also have to say this with some reluctance, but I've got to say it. The Democratic Party is certainly not as guilty as the Republican Party of being shills for the oligarchy. I mean, the Democratic Party really is different. I don't want to engage in invidious notions of the parties are equally culpable. But there are Wall Street and corporate Democrats like Jamie Dimon who have exerted a huge influence in the Democratic Party and made the party actually less representative of working people than it used to be. The Democrats have not only abandoned the white working class over the past 40 years, they've also abandoned the working class over the past 40 years. And I think that is not only a gigantic political problem and a huge policy problem, but I think it also explains to some extent the rise of Donald Trump. And it's critically important that Democrats embrace the working class and make the working class once again part of the Democratic coalition. And I'm not talking only about unionized workers, but that is a big part of it, but all working class. There's no reason anybody in the working class should believe for a second that Donald Trump and the Republicans care about them. They don't.
Here's a question from Walter King. Are there any examples of modern day societies that have successfully reversed their march toward oligarchy before it reached an irreversible point? If so, what can we learn? And a related question from Teresa Peterson, what countries, in your opinion, get capitalism right? so that workers are not always taken advantage of and billionaires are not the only winners?
Well, there are a number of countries that are doing it far better than we are. In fact, I venture to say every advanced country is doing it better than we are in terms of protecting workers, their health, their unemployment, their situation right now. But which are doing it best? I think that obviously the Nordic, so-called Nordic countries are doing it very well. Australia, even with a conservative government, is doing it better than we are. New Zealand, I'm very impressed with. They've done it exceedingly well. South Korea has a very good government, very good system. There are a lot of problems, but my hat's off to South Korea. There are a number of places around the world we can learn something from, even Canada. I mean, sometimes when we talk about doing it better, we talk as if this is kind of an exotic notion, but all we have to do is go a few miles north of where most of us or many of us live, and we find a nation called Canada, where even conservative Canadians understand and are willing to entertain the possibility that there's a common good and act on that assumption much more easily than so many Americans, particularly Americans who call themselves conservatives or Republicans. Let me just say one final thing, Thea, and that is that for 30 years, between 1946 and about 1976, the United States was growing its middle class. Now, we still had a long way to go. I don't want to paint with a broad brush and rose-colored glasses in terms of looking at these years, but I lived through them. I saw the civil rights movement. I saw the movement toward voting rights and women having more and more economic power, and Medicare and Medicaid and the Environmental Protection Act. We at least were trying to expand our notion of shared prosperity. And we also believed in competent government. And we were not nearly as cynical about government as we are now, for good reason. But I don't think we need even to look abroad. Why don't we just look at what happened between 1946 and 1976 and say, well, what can we learn from those years where we were doing it right, or we're on the way to doing it right?
Thank you. And that's something, certainly it's been a big theme for EPI, is growing together when productivity growth and wages grow together. And when that gap opens up between productivity growth and wage growth, you see that workers aren't getting their fair share of the wealth that they're creating. And that causes, it doesn't just cause inequality and unfairness, but it also causes the economy not to be as efficient as it could be, because it saps the vitality of the economy. Here's a
Well,
question.
it saps the vitality of the economy in a very, very specific way, because the rich don't buy nearly as much with every dollar they bring in as the middle, working class, and the poor. They spend it, and by spending it, they mostly spend it in the local locality or the region they are in, and that spending has a huge multiplier effect on the economy. So when more and more wealth, more and more income go to the top, no wonder the economy tends toward fragility. This is not a difficult concept to understand.
And somebody mentioned that in the chat box, about 70% of the US GDP is driven by consumption. So when businesses, in their wisdom, cut wages and cut jobs, then they're actually cutting their own consumer base. So there's that piece of it. Here's a question from Benjamin Martinez. Could you talk about the limits of the current tools in our economic toolbox, i.e. neoliberalism, to deal with a disaster of this proportion? Do you have thoughts on the community wealth building movements that have gained momentum over the years, and things such as public utilities, public banks, worker co-ops, et cetera?
Yes, and I do mention this in the book. I think the community banks, public banks, state banks, and other kinds of community organizations are not only critical, but will become even more critical in the future. One thing this pandemic should have, and hopefully will teach us, is the importance of having a public health system, having a health system that is not a corporate for-profit health system, having an environment that really does protect the health of everyone. I think there is some evidence. You saw in the recent Harvard study that having a bad environment makes people more susceptible to pandemics. And I hope we also learn the importance of having, well, whether you like the idea of a universal basic income, or you like the idea of at least a subsistence income, I don't care what you call it, but everybody needs to be protected from falling into dire poverty. And we have to stop this notion that if you provide people with a subsistence income, they are therefore going to lose any incentive to work. That's just baloney. Hopefully, we're going to learn a lot coming out of this pandemic, and a lot of attitudes may be changed about many of these issues.
And there are a lot of questions in the Q&A box about messaging and about how to change attitudes. Nat Samuel says, are we socialized to accept the oligarchy democracy divide as normal? And how does that work?
No, I don't think we are. I don't think people really do think about the divide as between democracy and oligarchy. When I began talking about this theme not that long ago, people were sort of shocked. They said, "Well, no, wait a minute. No, the biggest divide is between Democrats and Republicans, or between conservatives and liberals, or the right and the left." We've become so accustomed to fighting among ourselves for the crumbs. And we've become so accustomed to thinking that our enemy is them being the opposite party, that we are not seeing the actual power structure behind all of this. And the power structure behind all of this is the thing that is most important. As Louis Brandeis, the great justice, said, coming out of the first time. I mean, I call this the second time we've had a kind of a Robert Barron's, and we've had a system in which we had an oligarchy. We certainly had that in the late 19th century and beginning of the 20th century. And the great jurist Louis Brandeis said at that time, he said, we have a choice. We can either have great wealth in the hands of a few, or we can have a democracy, but we can't have both. And that notion that Louis Brandeis understood is so relevant to now that we are in this second Gilded Age.
If you were advising an incoming new president in January of 2021, what would you put as the top policy priorities to achieve more equitable economic growth in the United States? What would you do?
God forbid, if the pandemic is still with us in January of 2021, and I fear that if I understand Anthony Fauci correctly, the more we so-called reopen the country, the more likely it is that we are going to suffer continuously 2,000 deaths a day. And if that's the case, then in 2021, the first priority of the new president is to deal with this public health crisis in ways that Donald Trump and his goon squad did not deal with it. But beyond that, yes, we're still going to be in an economic crisis. I think it's vitally important not just to stimulate the economy, because stimulating the economy, you can stimulate the economy by doing what? Stupid things like big tax breaks for the rich. Or trickle down economics, more bailouts for big companies. That is not going to help. What you really need to do is get more money in the hands of working people, of the middle class, of the poor. You've got to, and there are a variety of understandings of this. The combination, as I said, of a subsistence wage, subsistence income, along with guaranteed jobs, along with an unemployment insurance system that really works and provides enough money so people can make a living if they in the downdrafts of this economy. You've got to have a stimulus that is big enough, and that's really the issue. I think that Thea, the Democrats in the House came up with a $3 trillion plan yesterday. Nancy Pelosi pursued it, and I think in many respects it makes a lot of sense. I would say it's not big enough. We were until recently almost a $21 trillion economy. $21 trillion a year we were capable of producing. We now have almost 25% unemployment. In fact, I think we probably will have 25% unemployment within 2 months. A $21 trillion economy with all that much underutilized capacity certainly has the ability to provide a stimulus that gets money into people's hands that is much larger, far larger than $3 trillion. Let's be clear about the dimensions and scale of this problem. It's much, much larger than we're talking about.
Absolutely. Here's a little bit of a shift from Alan Krinsky. He's asking, can you speak about American oligarchy in terms of race and systemic racism?
Yes, racism is a big part of it. I mean, as I said, one of the techniques of the oligarchy is to pit us against each other. And one of the ways that we've been pitted against each other since before the founding of the Republic is through racism. And not just racism, but also misogyny and xenophobia. I mean, these are not new techniques. And the oligarchy has been using racism as a vehicle for preventing Blacks and whites from coming together in coalition, a coalition that the oligarchy has been deathly afraid of. I mean, afraid of for over 200 years in terms of people joining together across racial lines, across class lines, and creating a more equitable society and creating a society that preserves and develops and enhances and makes more robust our democracy.
And we have a question here from Senator Tom Harkin, who says he's a big fan and follower of Bob Reich for nearly 30 years. And Tom Harkin wants to know what your view is on the wealth tax. Is this the right time to go deep for a wealth tax?
Well, first of all, let me say I really miss you, Tom. You are a champion of the working class. Your time in the Senate, was one of the great times in the Senate, and you're one of my heroes. Yes, I think it is time for a wealth tax. We've got to talk about a wealth tax. Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders put it on the plate nationally. They put a lot of research into it. It has good research behind it, and it is just and necessary. There is no reason that people these days should be receiving billions and billions and billions of dollars for what? For nothing. I mean, let's talk about Jeff Bezos for a second. He got a lot of kudos for investing $100 million in a food bank a few weeks ago. Well, that's nice. I'm glad he did that. Philanthropy is very, very nice. But that's 11 days of Jeff Bezos's income from his fortune. 11 days. Jeff Bezos, meanwhile, is disregarding Amazon workers in Amazon warehouses. Jeff Bezos is basically using his political power to prevent Amazon from being taxed. I mean, Amazon last year paid almost zero in taxes. It's one of the biggest companies and most profitable companies in the world. Yes, you need a wealth tax because that's one of the only ways we are going to begin to make inroads on this vicious cycle of oligarchy and erosion of our democracy. It's also necessary to get some money, by the way, because we can't just continue to racking up larger and larger national debts. But the primary benefit of a wealth tax is to start eroding these massive fortunes that are for no reason and really have no positive social impact at all.
So we've been talking a lot about the excess of power at the top. But what about the erosion of power for working people? And in particular, Robert Sessions asks about the decline and weakening of labor unions in the past few decades. And speaking of Amazon, of course, one of the things we've seen in this crisis is workers taking it upon themselves to organize even when they don't have a union. They haven't.
Yes, and what does Amazon do? It fires them. That is supposed to be against the law. Hello, Jeff Bezos. That is illegal. You fire workers for trying to organize a union. Let me just say this, Thea. One of the techniques of certainly the oligarchy over the last 40 years has been to bust unions. And they've done everything they could. 40 years ago, 35% 35% of workers in the private sector of the United States were unionized. Today, 6.4% of workers in the private sector are unionized. 40 years ago, with 35% of workers unionized, workers had a voice. Because even the non-unionized workers were in companies whose bosses were, or whose CEOs were saying, well, we better do exactly what the prevailing wages and the prevailing working conditions and the prevailing benefits in those unionized contracts. Otherwise, we are going to be unionized next. But when you have 6.4% of the private sector unionized, you don't have any voice. You don't have any power. I mean, even in the Democratic Party, Barack Obama and Bill Clinton had 2 years at the start of both of their 8-year administrations when they had the House and the Senate to themselves. The Democrats controlled the House and the Senate in the first 2 years of Bill Clinton's and Barack Obama's administrations. Now, you would think that 2 Democratic presidents would maybe push labor law reform, maybe make it easier to form unions, maybe make it harder to bust unions. But you see, the Democratic Party was even then in the throes and under the control, too much so, of corporate and Wall Street Democrats. So neither the Obama administration nor the Clinton administration, even though the Democrats had control of both houses, embraced labor law reform.
And that is a disgrace that we're still living with the legacy of that for many years. And I hope that the next Democratic president or the next progressive president won't make the same mistake, that we will put labor law reform as a priority, because the rules are so stacked. Speaking of, the rules being rigged and fixed against working people, the nation's labor laws were written 80 years ago, and they're very outdated. We need to make sure that workers have a fair shake, that the penalties are adequate, that there are many avenues for working people to have a voice.
Well, Thea, I can tell you, when I was labor secretary, workers would want, even in the 25 years ago, workers who wanted to form unions, and if workers got fired for trying to form a union, which is against the law, what happened? At worst, they got a kind of the employers were kind of got a rap on the knuckles. They had to pay back wages and rehire the worker. I mean,
that's business.
It was a cost of doing business. It still is a cost of doing business. And now you have right to work states, so-called right to work states, that actually a lot of companies are threatening their unions. Even if they're unionized, we're going to go to a right to work state if you don't give us wage givebacks, and if you don't moderate your demands, and if you don't allow us and our shareholders and our executives to take more of the pot.
Yes, and I think we have time for one more question. I'm going to go with Ron Hira. Says, nearly 30 years ago, you wrote the seminal book, Work of Nations. Given the benefit of hindsight and wisdom, everything you've learned in 30 years, what do you think, what did you get right, wrong, and the lessons to put to action?
Well, Ron, I got everything right, sadly. In that book, you may recall, I've only barely recall, I talked about there being classes of workers, one called symbolic analysts, who were doing very well, who would actually do better and better in the future, who had the university degrees and were manipulating symbols, sitting behind computers. But there was a second group, a group of personal service workers who were going to do worse and worse. Because they were in competition with each other. They didn't have all that much education, and they were easily manipulated if they didn't have unions behind them, and a lot of them did not have unions. And then I also talked about another class of workers, workers who actually have all but disappeared, and those are the routine workers, manufacturing and clerical workers who are being replaced by automation. So right now, what do we have? In this pandemic and before the pandemic, we have symbolic analysts who are sitting behind their computers, collecting paychecks, doing work remotely, and they are managerial, technical, and professional workers. And then we have our personal service workers who have either lost their jobs because they're in retail, restaurant, or hotel work, or they are on the front lines in hospitals, and they are in warehouses, and they are actually risking their lives. And so what I predicted in whatever it was, 25, 30 years ago in the Work of Nations has sadly, tragically come to pass. And Ron, one more thing I said in that book was that we would find ourselves with our richest and wealthiest people trying to secede from the rest of us in terms of not paying taxes and relying upon their own services rather than public services. I wished it were not going to be the case, but I saw it beginning to happen 25 or 30 years ago, and that's exactly what has happened. The rich are seceding, and in this pandemic, they are seceding more, perhaps, and more blatantly than ever before.
Well, I do remember that book, and it was prescient. So maybe everybody should go back and look at that just to get a little bit of a
Just to
insight.
be depressed.
And I have one last one, which is more forward-looking, because I want to end on a nicer note. So Roger Madison says, will the young progressives just change things around the edges, or will they make fundamental changes? And how can we make those arguments to take us in the direction of fundamental and structural change? And what do you think would be most important in doing that?
Well, Thea, it's got to be fundamental change because the vicious cycles are becoming more vicious. I'm talking about wealth creating more corruption of politics, which creates a different market structure, which creates more wealth, and then leading to all kinds of economic fragility and making us unprepared for environmental disasters, such as arguably we are in right now. So we don't have any choice. The system has got to be fundamentally reorganized and reorganized in ways that spread the benefits of economic change and economic growth, and also make our democracy work for most people. Now, how is that going to happen? I can't dictate and I can't tell you exactly, but Thea, I am sure that it is going to happen because it has to happen. We don't have a choice.
Thank you so much, Bob. And I'm with you. I'm an optimist because there are more of us than there are of them. There's more Democrats than there are oligarchs, and we need to strengthen and save our democracy for all of us. So thank you so much for writing the book. Everybody who's listening, go buy the book. It's called The System: Who Rigged It, How We Fix It. So you can find it, Google it, you'll figure it out. You can get it on Kindle. You can get it in the mail. And I also want to, I want to thank Bob, not just for the book and for being here with us today, but for all of his work, for his lifetime of work. And I wanted to say to the rest of you, if you sign up for EPI's newsletter, you won't miss our upcoming webinars and the latest EPI research focused on defending and promoting worker interest in economic policy debates. So go to our website, www.epi.org/sign-up. We have our next webinar is coming up on May 27th. It's going to be amazing. From Here to Equality, Reparations for Black Americans in the 21st Century with Professors Sandy Darity and Kirsten Mullen, May 27th at 2 o'clock. But go ahead and sign up for our newsletter, and that way you won't miss any upcoming webinars. So thank you all for joining us. I know we had people from Sydney, Australia, from Panama City, from Colorado, Nebraska, all over the country, all over the world. Thank you so much for spending an hour with us. And Bob Reich, thank you for your wisdom and thank you for your time.
Well, Thea, thank you, and thank EPI.
Bye-bye.